Garrett Hayes had learned early in his independent freight career that the key to survival was knowing which questions not to ask. Cargo manifests sometimes had discrepancies. Clients sometimes had questionable reputations. Docking stations sometimes existed in legal gray zones where sovereignty law was more suggestion than enforcement. Aethros Station was definitely one of those gray zones. It hung in orbit around a gas giant nobody had bothered naming, serving as a commercial hub for species who preferred their business conducted away from oversight. The station was massive, a chaotic assemblage of modules and sections added over decades with no apparent planning beyond. We need more space to make more profit. Garrett's ship, the Wandering Scout, was locked into Dock Clamp 17, and he descended into the station proper with a straightforward mission: purchase replacement components for his environmental system before the recyclers failed completely and he asphyxiated in his sleep. Simple, professional. The kind of transaction he'd completed 100 times. The market district was overwhelming, multiple levels of commercial chaos where beings from dozens of species conducted business in a babel of languages and customs. His translator implant worked overtime, feeding him approximations of meaning when direct translation failed. Signs advertised goods in three-dimensional holographic projections. The air was thick with scents his human biology couldn't properly categorize, though several registered as vaguely threatening. He'd gotten lost almost immediately. The market's layout defied conventional mapping, corridors splitting and reconnecting in patterns that suggested either deliberate confusion or complete lack of urban planning. What should have been a 10-minute walk to the environmental systems vendor had become 30 minutes of wandering through sections he'd never intended to visit. That's when he turned a corner and found himself facing the captive pens. Garrett stopped walking, his stomach tightening with recognition he didn't want to have. He'd heard about these sections, had been warned by other pilots that certain market levels operated industries most civilized systems didn't permit. But hearing about it and seeing it were different experiences. The pens were reinforced enclosures arranged in rows, each holding beings from species he recognized, and several he didn't. All wore neural restraints, collars or bands that suppressed resistance, enforced compliance, turned sentient beings into manageable commodities. Signs displayed information in multiple languages: species classification, skill assessments, pricing structures. Indentured labor contracts, the signs called them. Legal terminology that dressed up slavery in bureaucratic language and made it permissible in designated commercial zones. Garrett had seen it before, always in periphery, always something he walked past quickly while telling himself it wasn't his business. He was one pilot, barely making ends meet, with no power to change systems that had existed long before humans entered the galactic community. But today, something made him stop. Maybe it was exhaustion. He'd been running routes for 6 weeks straight, sleeping in 3-hour intervals, operating on stimulants and stubbornness. Maybe it was the fact that his last contract had fallen through, leaving him with just enough credits to cover basic repairs but not enough buffer for emergencies. Or maybe it was the Veith in the smaller pen, separated from the main auction area. Garrett recognized the species from cultural databases he'd studied during transit. Veith were rare this far from their home systems, a species known for their crystalline bioluminescent markings and complex social structures built around consensus and shared decision-making. This one was young, probably equivalent to human late 20s based on marking patterns. They sat in the corner of their enclosure, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around themselves in a posture of compression. Their markings, which should have been vibrant, constantly shifting through colors that communicated emotion and intent, were dim, barely visible beneath layers of grime and the suppression effect of the neural restraint clamped around their throat. But their eyes were what stopped Garrett completely. Intelligent, aware, watching the crowd with an expression that suggested they were calculating odds and finding them all unfavorable. Not broken, not resigned to their situation, not yet. The market continued around him, traders negotiating prices for captive labor, guards maintaining order with visible weapons, species he couldn't name conducting business in languages his translator gave up trying to process. And Garrett stood there, staring at a captive who shouldn't be his problem, feeling something uncomfortable settle in his chest. Moral obligation, his mother would have called it. The stubborn Hayes family inability to walk away from injustice, even when walking away was obviously the smart choice. He checked his credit balance on his tablet. 47,000 credits. Enough for the environmental system repairs, fuel for the next 3 jumps, docking fees at 2 stations, and about 6 weeks of food if he stretched it. Not enough to buy a captive's freedom. Probably not enough to even make a meaningful bid at whatever auction these beings were destined for. But maybe enough to ask questions he knew he shouldn't ask. Garrett approached the oversight terminal, where a Quen trader, insectoid, multiple limbs manipulating holographic displays simultaneously, compound eyes that tracked movement with unsettling precision, monitored several enclosures at once. The Quen didn't acknowledge him immediately. Attention focused on a heated negotiation with a Aethros noble overpricing for a group of laborers. Garrett waited, hands in his pockets, trying to look casual rather than like someone about to do something spectacularly stupid. When the Quen finally turned those compound eyes toward him, the assessment was immediate and dismissive. Human, poorly dressed, probably couldn't afford anything worth selling. You're in the wrong section. Prime stock is 3 levels up. I'm interested in that one. Garrett gestured toward the Veith's enclosure. The Quen's attention shifted, mandibles clicking in patterns his translator struggled with. Veith. Rare acquisition. Cognitive capabilities ideal for complex labor. Cultural conditioning makes them loyal once properly bonded to an owner. Starting bid is 80,000 credits. It was an absurd price, clearly inflated to dismiss him. Garrett felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice level. I'm not bidding, what's the release fee? The Quen went very still. In their species, Garrett had read somewhere, stillness indicated either confusion or threat assessment. Release fee. The legal minimum to terminate the indenture contract. It's in the sovereignty regulations. Any contract can be bought out at assessed value plus administrative fees. He'd looked it up during the walkover, skimming regulations he'd never thought he'd need. The Quen's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound his translator didn't bother rendering. 42,000 credits, plus processing fees, non-negotiable. It was still most of his operating capital, money he needed. Money that represented safety and independence and the ability to keep flying. Garrett pulled up his credit account, stared at the balance for 5 seconds, and initiated the transfer. The transaction processed with bureaucratic efficiency that felt surreal given what was actually happening. Credits transferred. Contract status updated to terminated released. Ownership field displaying no holder. The Quen stared at the confirmation with visible confusion, compound eyes reflecting data streams that clearly didn't match expected patterns. You didn't claim ownership transfer. You just released them. The translator struggled with the Quen's tone, finally settling on incomprehensible. That was the point, but you paid premium release fees for an asset you're not claiming. This is economically irrational. Probably. The Quen made a sound his translator gave up on entirely, then activated a comm device, speaking rapidly in their own language. Calling supervisors, most likely, or maybe station security to report that a human had just done something that violated common sense, if not actual regulations. 2 guards, species Garrett didn't recognize, both heavily armed, approached the Veith's enclosure and entered with practiced efficiency. One held a device that interfaced with the neural restraint while the other maintained ready posture, in case the captive became violent upon release. The restraint disengaged with a sound like breaking glass. The Veith gasped, their entire body convulsing as neural suppression lifted. Their crystalline markings suddenly blazed with bioluminescence, beautiful patterns cascading across their skin in colors Garrett had no names for. Something between blue and silver, touches of purple-green, shifting hues that seemed to exist outside normal visible spectrum. They staggered, nearly falling before catching themselves against the enclosure wall. Their breathing was ragged, hands trembling as they touched their throat where the restraint had been. The guards backed away, clearly uncertain about protocols for this situation. The Quen was still speaking rapidly into their comm device. Garrett approached the enclosure slowly, stopping at the entrance. The Veith looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time without the dulling effect of neural suppression. Their expressions cycled through confusion, calculation, suspicion. You're free, Garrett said, keeping his voice calm and hoping his translator was rendering it accurately. No contract, no obligation, you can go wherever you want. The Veith didn't move. They spoke, their voice rough from disuse or mistreatment, in a language that made his translator stutter before producing. You purchased me. I am bound to your service according to contract law and transfer protocols. No, I paid your release fee, there's no contract, there's no transfer, you're not bound to anyone. The concept clearly didn't register. The Veith looked at the neural restraint lying on the ground, at the guards backing away, at Garrett standing in the enclosure entrance with his hands clearly visible and empty. That is not how this functions. Ownership transfers or maintains. Release without claim is. They trailed off, apparently unable to articulate what it was because it didn't exist in their conceptual framework. Around them, the market had gone quiet. Nearby traders had stopped their negotiations, attention drawn by the unusual transaction. Guards were converging, though whether to maintain order or investigate irregularity was unclear. The Quen had been joined by 2 other members of their species, probably administrators or supervisors. One of them addressed Garrett with audible confusion rendered through his translator. Human, you have violated market protocols. Captives must be claimed or returned to holding. Free release is not recognized under standard commercial practice. It's legal according to sovereignty regulations, Garrett replied, pulling up the relevant codes on his tablet. Section 47, subsection 12. Any indentured labor contract can be terminated through payment of assessed fees calculated by market administrators. It says nothing about requiring new ownership claims. The law assumes new ownership. This is understood by all parties. Then your understanding is incomplete. I paid the fees. The contract is terminated. They're free. The word free seemed to echo across the market as translators processed it into multiple languages. The silence was spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, conversations dying as beings turned to observe what was happening. The Veith took a step forward, then stopped, their bioluminescent markings pulsing in patterns that might indicate distress or confusion or calculation. They spoke again, their voice stronger now. You claim no ownership, you demand no service, you expect no loyalty or compensation. They paused, their markings shifting through rapid color changes. Why? It was the question Garrett had been avoiding asking himself. Why spend money he needed on freeing one captive in a market that held hundreds? Why risk complications in a station where he had no support and minimal legal protection? Why do something that wouldn't change the system and might not even benefit the individual he was trying to help? The honest answer, because it felt like the right thing to do, would sound insane to most beings in this market. But Garrett was too tired and too committed to the stupid decision he'd made to lie about it now. Because owning people is wrong. I don't care what legal framework you dress it up in or what economic justifications you provide. Slavery is slavery. I had enough credits to buy one person's freedom, so I did. That's it. No complex philosophy, no strategic planning, just, I couldn't walk past you and do nothing. The silence was profound now. Traders had completely stopped their business. Guards formed a perimeter, though their weapons were lowered. This wasn't a security threat, just a situation nobody had protocols for. Aethros noble, massive, four-armed, wearing ceremonial armor that indicated high status, pushed through the crowd to confront Garrett directly. Their translator rendered their speech in a deep, grinding voice. You disrupt established order. Freedom without purpose, without command, without structure, is chaos. You have created liability without ownership. This is economically irrational and socially destructive. It's called autonomy, Garrett shot back, feeling his temper fray despite knowing anger was tactically stupid. The right to self-determination, the ability to make your own choices without someone else claiming you as property. Property with agency, the Aethros corrected with the confidence of someone used to being right. The indentured system provides structure, purpose, survival resources. You offer nothing, not protection, not guidance, not resources. You condemn this Veith to purposeless existence in a hostile environment. I'm offering choice. They can decide for themselves what purpose means and what survival requires. Naive human idealism. You project your species' values onto beings with different evolutionary histories and social structures. The Aethros gestured toward the Veith with one of their 4 arms. Ask them, do they want this freedom you've imposed without consultation? All eyes turned to the Veith, who stood just outside their enclosure. Markings blazing with colors that Garrett's limited knowledge suggested indicated intense cognitive processing. When they spoke, their voice carried across the market with unexpected authority. The human claims no ownership, demands no service, expects no loyalty or compensation for resources expended. They turned to look at Garrett directly, their expression unreadable. This is unprecedented in my experience and violates my understanding of economic interaction among sentient species. Garrett felt his stomach sink. He'd freed them without asking if freedom was what they wanted. The Aethros was right. He'd projected human values onto a being from a completely different cultural context. But then the Veith continued. Arguments broke out in multiple languages as traders, guards, and observers reacted to the Veith's declaration. The Quen administrators were speaking rapidly into comm devices, probably summoning higher authorities to handle a situation that had clearly escaped their administrative scope. The Aethros noble was making grinding sounds that his translator rendered as profound disapproval. Station security arrived, heavily armed beings from 3 different species, led by a Drev captain whose scaled face displayed no readable emotion. They moved with professional efficiency, creating a perimeter around Garrett, the Veith, and the immediate area. Garrett Hayes, human citizen. The Drev's translator produced a neutral voice that somehow conveyed authority anyway. You are detained for market disruption and violation of established commercial protocols. I broke no laws, Garrett replied, though he was acutely aware that legal technicalities might not matter here. Sovereignty regulations permit contract buyouts. I followed proper procedures and paid all assessed fees. You created market disruption. Multiple negotiations have been abandoned. Traders are threatening to cease operations until protocols are clarified. Market stability is compromised. That's not my fault. I conducted a legal transaction. If the market stability depends on everyone following unwritten assumptions instead of actual regulations, that's a system design problem. The Drev made a sound like stones grinding. Your actions have consequences beyond legal technicality. The precedent created by release without claim threatens established commercial practices across multiple systems. Good, Garrett said, surprising himself with the vehemence. If the system depends on everyone agreeing not to actually free captives, even when regulations technically permit it, then maybe the system deserves to be threatened. The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Some beings made sounds of approval, others angry rejection. Arguments intensified, becoming heated enough that guards moved to maintain physical separation between opposing factions. The Veith stood beside Garrett, their markings cycling through colors rapidly. When they spoke, their voice cut through the chaos with surprising authority. I claim autonomous status under sovereignty law. Section 63, subsection 7. Any sentient being not bound by valid contract may declare independence and self-governance, if capable of resource self-sufficiency. The Drev's expression shifted, surprise, maybe, or recalculation. Autonomous status requires sponsor guarantee and verified resource capability. I sponsor myself. My cognitive labor has market value. I will contract independently for services rather than accepting indenture. The Veith's markings pulsed with colors that Garrett's translator tentatively identified as determination. The human demonstrated that value exists beyond ownership structures. I will prove this assertion through practical application. It was a bold claim, probably legally questionable, definitely unprecedented. But it shifted the dynamic immediately. The Veith was no longer a freed captive waiting for instruction. They were a being claiming agency and demanding recognition. The Quen administrators protested, lost value, contract violation, market precedent. The Aethros noble argued about social disruption and the dangers of autonomous claims without established hierarchy. Other voices joined from the crowd. Some supporting the Veith's declaration, others defending traditional structures. A few raising points about legal precedent and regulatory interpretation that Garrett's translator struggled to process. The Drev captain consulted with their security team, probably checking regulations and assessing the legal landscape. After what felt like forever but was probably only minutes, they made a decision. The transaction stands as legally compliant. The Veith's autonomous claim is unprecedented but not explicitly prohibited under current sovereignty regulations. They turn to address the crowd. Market operations will continue. Protocols regarding contract release will be reviewed by station administration. Any being attempting to forcibly reclaim the Veith will face security response. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of, we don't know what to do with this, so we're making it someone else's problem later. Garrett would take it. Hayes, you are released with formal warning. Future actions that disrupt market stability will result in station ban regardless of technical legality. Understood. The security perimeter dissolved as guards moved to manage the crowd and restore normal market operations. Traders returned to their negotiations, though arguments about the incident continued in clusters. The Quen administrators retreated to their stations, probably drafting reports that would make this someone else's administrative headache. The Veith approached Garrett, their markings displaying colors he still couldn't interpret with any confidence. You gave freedom expecting nothing. This is incomprehensible to most beings here. They paused, colors shifting through their markings. It is also the most valuable gift I have received since my capture. Just take care of yourself, Garrett said, uncomfortable with gratitude and unsure what to do with it. Make it mean something. I will, and others will hear of this. The Veith's markings brightened. Autonomy claimed, not granted. Freedom chosen, not awarded through ownership transfer. You have created precedent, human. It will echo beyond this market. They turned and walked toward the market exit, their bioluminescent markings visible even in the crowd. A beacon of something the market hadn't accounted for, moving with purpose toward whatever came next. Garrett watched them go, feeling exhausted and broke and uncertain about whether what he'd done was brave or stupid, or some combination that wouldn't become clear until later. Marcus, a fellow freight pilot he recognized from previous stops, approached with an expression caught between admiration and concern. You just spent your operating capital to free a captive you have no use for, created a market incident that might get you banned from half the stations in this sector, and possibly started some kind of legal precedent chain that traders' guilds will fight for years. Marcus shook his head. That was either the most noble thing I've seen or the dumbest financial decision in history. Probably both. What are you going to do now? You barely have enough credits for fuel. I'll figure it out. Take contracts I wouldn't normally consider. Tighten the budget. Survive. Garrett started walking toward the exit, suddenly desperate to leave this entire section behind. I couldn't walk past that pen and do nothing, Marcus. If that was stupid, then I'm stupid. I can live with that easier than living with having 42,000 credits and knowing exactly where they came from. Marcus followed for a few steps, then stopped. For what it's worth, I hope you're right. About the precedent, about autonomy meaning something. Because if you're wrong, you just destroyed your financial stability for nothing. Yeah, I hope I'm right too. Garrett made it back to his ship 3 hours later. Environmental system parts purchased with his remaining credits. Supplies minimized to bare necessities, ready to leave Aethros Station and hopefully never return. But as he initiated departure procedures, his comm pinged with an incoming message. Text only, source encrypted, sender unknown. Word is spreading. 12 captives have claimed autonomous status in markets across 3 systems, citing Aethros Precedent. Sovereignty Collective is convening regulatory review committee. Traders' guilds are threatening coordinated strikes. You've disrupted centuries of established practice with one transaction. Was one Veith's freedom worth the chaos you've created? Garrett stared at the message for a long moment, his hands still on the flight controls. Then he deleted it and engaged his engines, plotting course for the next system. The wandering scout cleared Aethros Station's traffic control boundary and engaged subliminal drives, accelerating toward the jump point that would take Garrett to the Kess system, and hopefully a contract worth enough to keep him flying. He should have felt regret, probably. 42,000 credits gone, operating capital depleted, financial stability traded for a moral decision that might not even matter in the larger scheme of things. Instead, he felt tired. Bone-deep exhaustion that came from making a choice that cost more than he could afford, but less than walking away would have. His comm pinged again. Different source this time, also encrypted but with a signature that suggested official origin. Garrett considered ignoring it, then opened the message because ignoring official communications was a good way to have warrants issued. Text displayed across his navigation screen. Garrett Hayes, your actions on Aethros Station have been noted by multiple regulatory bodies. The Sovereignty Collective's Commercial Standards Division is investigating potential violations of market protocol. However, your transaction has also been cited by advocacy organizations as precedent for autonomous release claims. You are requested to provide testimony at upcoming regulatory hearings regarding contract release procedures. It was bureaucratic language trying to be neutral but clearly indicating he'd stepped into something much larger than one freed captive. Hearings, investigations, his name attached to regulatory debates that would probably drag on for years. He drafted a response. I'm a freight pilot, not an activist. I made one decision based on what I could afford and what I could live with. If that created precedent, other people can argue about what it means. I'll be available for testimony when I'm not trying to survive financially. He sent it and immediately regretted the tone, but was too exhausted to care. The jump point approached, a visual distortion in space where his ship's drives would engage and throw him across light years in subjective minutes. Garrett initiated the sequence, watching countdown timers while his mind wandered to the Veith, to their bioluminescent markings blazing with colors he couldn't name, to their declaration that autonomy was worth claiming even without support structures or guaranteed survival. His nav computer chimed an alert, incoming tight beam transmission, high priority tag. Garrett almost ignored it, then recognized the source signature. It was from the Veith. He opened the channel. Text only? Garrett Hayes. I have secured temporary labor contract with independent data analysis firm. Payment is sufficient for basic needs plus modest surplus. I am documenting my experience for distribution through advocacy networks. Your action created possibility where none existed. This is not forgotten. Something in Garrett's chest loosened slightly. They were okay. At least for now, at least temporarily, the being he'd freed was surviving without the structures everyone claimed were necessary. He sent back, glad you're managing, stay safe. The response came within seconds. Safety is not the goal. Autonomy is the goal. Safety might follow, or might not. The choice to pursue one over the other is itself the value you gave me. The jump sequence engaged before Garrett could respond. Reality twisted. His ship's drives punched through normal space, and the wandering scout entered the strange non-time of hyperspace transit where minutes passed subjectively, but hours or days elapsed outside. Garrett used the time to review his financial situation, which was exactly as dire as expected. He had enough fuel for 3 jumps, enough credits for minimal supplies, and approximately 6 weeks before he'd need to find work that paid significantly better than his usual contracts, or start making decisions about whether to sell his ship and accept employment with a larger freight corporation. His tablet pinged with notifications, messages from other pilots, news feeds picking up the Aethros incident, speculation about regulatory changes. He ignored most of it, but one caught his attention. Breaking. Traders Guild Coalition announces temporary suspension of indentured labor contracts in 12 market systems pending regulatory clarification. Guild spokesman cites unprecedented legal ambiguity created by recent autonomous release claims. Independent advocacy groups claim victory, while commercial interests condemn emotional human interference in established economic practices. Garrett stared at the headline, 12 systems, temporary suspension, all because one pilot had made a decision that probably wouldn't have mattered if everyone hadn't decided to react to it. Another message, this one from Marcus. You seeing this? They're calling you the Aethros Precedent. Traders are furious, advocacy groups want to make you a symbol, and you're probably going to be famous in the worst possible ways. Congratulations on destroying your anonymous existence. Garrett sent back, I just wanted to fix my environmental system and leave. This is not what I signed up for. Too late. You're a symbol now whether you like it or not. People are going to project their ideologies onto your action, and you won't get any say in how it's interpreted. Great, exactly what I needed. The hyperspace transit ended, dropping the wandering scout back into normal space at the edge of the Kess system. Garrett initiated system scans, looking for the contract beacon he was supposed to meet. Instead, his comm exploded with incoming transmissions. News organizations requesting interviews, advocacy groups asking him to speak at events, commercial interests sending threats thinly disguised as legal warnings about future market conduct. He ignored all of it, focusing on the contract beacon and the client who'd hired him to transport medical supplies to a colony station. Simple work. The kind of anonymous freight runs he'd built his career on. The client confirmed delivery details, and Garrett maneuvered toward the cargo transfer point, grateful for the return to normal operations and routine decisions. But as he was loading cargo containers, his tablet chimed with one more message. Source, unknown. Text, simple. You proved freedom has value beyond ownership. 27 captives have claimed autonomous status. 3 markets have closed pending regulatory review. The Traders Guild Coalition is threatening legal action. You've started something that won't stop just because you want to fly freight and be left alone. The question is whether you'll take responsibility for what you've created or pretend it has nothing to do with you. Garrett finished loading cargo, secured the containers, and returned to his cockpit. He stared at the message for a long time. He hadn't meant to start anything. Hadn't intended to be a symbol or precedent or catalyst for regulatory debates. He'd just seen a being in a cage and had enough credits to buy their freedom, and walking past without doing anything had felt worse than financial instability. But intention didn't change impact. What he'd done had echoed beyond one freed Veith, beyond Aethros Station, beyond his ability to control or direct. He couldn't unring that bell, couldn't make everyone stop, reacting to a precedent he'd accidentally created. But he also couldn't take responsibility for how others chose to interpret or weaponize that precedent. He wasn't a revolutionary, wasn't an activist. He was just a pilot who'd made one decision based on what he could live with. Garrett drafted a response to the unknown sender. I freed one captive because it felt right and